Hello, everyone. I'm Meg Rotzel, Curator of Exhibitions at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Welcome to today's opening program for Drawing Us Together, Public Life and Public Health in Contemporary Comics. I'm glad you're here with us today for this opening program featuring Hilary Shute, Distinguished Professor of English, Art, and Design at Northeastern University, and cartoonist Joel Christian Gill, the inaugural chair of Boston University's Master of Fine Arts in Visual Narrative, and James Sturm, co-founder and director of the Center for Cartoon Studies and editor of CCS's Graphic Guide series. For more on our panelists, you may visit our webpage where we have posted links for each of the participants. Before I tell you about the images that you've seen in the opening slideshow, I'd like to give you an overview of what we'll do in the next hour. First, we'll hear from James, who will talk about the graphic guides that anchor the exhibition, and then he'll engage in a conversation with Hilary and Joel. We'll break halfway through to see the slideshow again, followed by audience Q&A. Since I know we have a very engaged audience, we anticipate a lot of questions. We ask that you keep them short. This will increase the likelihood that we can address as many as possible in the time that we have. And before I briefly discuss how the exhibition came about, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors, whose generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public. We thank you. So, the idea for this exhibition began during the period of quarantine at the start of the pandemic. I, like many people, was struggling to read and retain information. Normally, when I read, images appear in my mind, like a movie, and because of stress, those images had gone dark. Fortunately, I picked up a comic, and the combination of picture and text made meaning. I could rely on the artist's drawing to get me to a point of understanding, which was a total relief. I started borrowing comics from the Harvard Library System and discovered that the majority originated from Harvard's Countway Medical Library, which was confusing to me. I thought that humanities or fine arts libraries would be the more likely source for comics. So I looked up the library and filled in that bar on the webpage that reads, "Ask a Librarian." So I asked why. It turns out the library had been purposefully collecting in the area of graphic medicine. And I learned from librarian Matthew No that the term denotes the role that comics play in the discourse about healthcare. I was delighted to visit the library and discover comics about anatomy, illness, mental health, disability, and the effects of racism and inequality, and so much more. And at the same time, James Sturm was a fellow at Radcliffe, where he was working on the graphic guide to the US healthcare system. The guides, which James will discuss further, is a part of a growing library published by the Center for Cartoon Studies. James also introduced me to the graphic guide to democracy created by Dan Knott. At no other time in my life were the democratic and healthcare systems so visible and so impactful to our institutions and collective well-being. I saw an overlap between the law, inequality, and the struggle for rights as being part of these two major systems. So what you'll see in the exhibition are large-scale graphics on the walls excerpted from the graphic guides, with a browsable library of comics that tell individual stories of American life. Comics have the unique ability to tell stories and create empathy. And so I chose to present a library of over 80 books so we could hear many voices and appreciate a variety of artistic styles. Additionally, I wanted to bring independently published books into the gallery. So we included a selection of zines from the Quarantine Public Library. That unique library, so many libraries in the show, was co-founded by Katie Garth and Tracy Hahn in 2020, and is a repository for books made by artists and published on the web for anyone, including you, to freely download, print, and assemble. So when you visit the gallery, and I hope you do, you may draw or fold a book from the Quarantine Public Library to take it home. And this exhibition was dreamt up to be a place where we could be together, gather, read, and draw. And I hope that you'll visit and join us for workshops and exhibition tours that are posted on our website. And now it's my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to James Sturm.
Thank you, Meg, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to everyone at Radcliffe that made this event possible. I'm really glad to be here today and talk comics with Hillary and Joel, and specifically about this wonderful exhibition. Where I'm going to start is like when I'm out publicly at non-cartooning events, or say I'm traveling and I'm talking to the person sitting next to me in an airplane, I'll introduce myself as a cartoonist, and the response I usually get is something like, "Really, that's so cool," which is nice to hear, of course. And then it's always followed by, "What character do you draw?" They're hoping they're meeting someone who draws Archie or Spider-Man. And I mention this now because I've learned not to take anything for granted, how the general public considers comics. So starting out today, it might be helpful to note that when I use the word comics, I'm talking about a medium. There are specific genres and formats that have been associated with comics, like superhero comic books or comic strips in newspapers, but these no more define comics than, say, musicals define theater. There's also no one style that defines comics. As the work in the show attests, comics can be drawn loose and cartoony or rendered realistically, or even both within the same panel. They can be drawn with pen and ink, watercolors, colored pencils, and any of these tools can be replicated and expanded upon working digitally. I think what all successful comics manage is that they give shape to content through combining text and images to create something greater than the sum of their parts. And this exhibition presents a really impressive array of work, including comics journalism, fiction, biographies, memoirs, graphic guides, and essays. And in each of these works, a cartoonist is rendering a space created from observation, from research, from memory, and invites the reader in to engage with the subject at hand. Now, as Meg noted, comics have a really unique way of generating empathy. I think that is certainly true. And when reading comics, you're always aware of the human hand. Drawings are so revealing and personal and can help forge a deep connection with a reader. In the case of the US healthcare system graphic guide, the style of drawing brings warmth to an intimidatingly large and dehumanizing topic that is often described by cold statistics. In a way, all the books you could say in this exhibition are graphic guides, right? Like whether it's a comic book about mental health for teens, or Roz Chast's memoir about her aging parents, can we talk about something more pleasant? A reader is given by this cartoonist a lay of the land. So when you're challenged to seek care or give care, you have some sense of what to expect, and you're a little more empowered and prepared for the journey ahead. So in addition to generating empathy, I think this exhibition shows how comics can also generate agency. One other thing I'd like to also touch upon when thinking about this show is the 3 publication formats that are highlighted in the exhibition. There's the whimsical mini comic or zine that's cleverly constructed from a single sheet of paper. And it's like an invitation to create, which the exhibition does. It gives you all the tools you need to make your own zine. And also the Quarantine Public Library, another shout out to them for curating and sharing a collection during the pandemic. The second format, of course, is the very playful and unintimidating comic book, which can be really sneaky in delivering substantive content into unlikely places. And finally, the more exalted graphic novel that isn't always a novel, but its size and scope demand attention and hopefully shelf space, not only in galleries, but in libraries and bookstores. One of the things I really appreciate about this exhibition is that none of these formats are privileged over the other. And if anything, this exhibition asks us to re-examine the status of the zine and the comic book as a format that draws us together, and for facilitating discourse on public life and public health. And perhaps this is something we can explore during our conversation today. So before I open up this conversation, I actually have a small confession. I've only seen pictures and schematics of the exhibition. I haven't actually visited the gallery. So I'm looking forward to hearing from Joel and Hillary, who have. And Hillary, I'm gonna, hello, Hillary. I'm gonna start with you. And what I would like to kind of ask you to start us off, can you share some of the impressions of what it was like visiting the exhibition? And if there's anything in particular that popped out at you?
James, thank you. I would love to talk about the exhibit and what it is like to be in that space. But just quickly, before I do that, I want to amplify something that Meg mentioned and that you were talking about too, which is that this exhibit is part of this ongoing conversation across different events and different media happening at Harvard and specifically at Radcliffe about public life and public health and comics. So, Meg mentioned the Countway Medical Library, their dedicated graphic medicine collection. That's so exciting. In 2021, there was an exploratory seminar at Radcliffe that you and I both participated in on the subject of graphic healthcare, convened by Thomas Deisbeck, a professor at Harvard Medical School. And then, in addition to you being a cartoonist at Radcliffe, this year's fellows include the artist academics Ebony Flowers and Rebecca Hall, which is just so exciting. So I see this show as, part of all of these conversations that have been happening for years around this subject and comics in the public sphere. So thank you for participating in that. One of the things I loved about being in the exhibit yesterday is the way it dealt with the issue of how to present comics in a museum space. And this is something that I talked about with Meg, last spring. I think a lot of cartoonists are probably aware of the fact that you are often creating work for print and not creating work to hang on a wall. And cartoonists have long complained that in a fine art context, their originals don't always, pop on a wall. They're doing work often meant for print. So one of the things I really loved about the show was the way it not only took panels from, these guides and put them on the wall, amplified, but it also elevated the form of the book. As people who pay attention to comics and cartooning and graphic novels know, the material format of the book is such an important part of how it creates meaning. And so I was so thrilled to see, 80 something titles, in the white cube of the fine art exhibit space on the wall, but also accessible for people to pick up and read, and to have, people be encouraged to pick up and read books at the same time that they're admiring them as printed works of art. So I think the show really cleverly pressurized a lot of conventional concepts that people have about what art is and what it's supposed to do. I also loved, of course, that if you visit the show, you not only see panels from Health and Wealth and This Is What Democracy Looks Like on the walls, but you also get to walk away with your own comic book. There's a spinner rack in the back of the room, a spinner rack like we used to see in drugstores, or still sometimes see in drugstores, where you can leave with something to hold in your hands. So again, I think the show does an amazing job of letting us look at something on the wall, consider comics as a form pressurizing typical categories in a fine art space, and also walk away with something haptic, something to hold and look at. So that kind of conversation happening in the space was something I really appreciated.
Thank you. Joel, you're someone who's actually been working on putting together an exhibition. So you're actually thinking about how to engage people around comics in a public space. And also as a cartoonist, you're kind of like a Swiss Army knife of cartooning. You've worked on memoir, fiction, biography, adaptation. You've published online, comic books, graphic novels. And I'm curious, like when you entered that space with all of your kind of experience as a cartoonist and all of your thinking about presenting in a public space, like what was going through your mind and how was your initial reactions to the show as well?
My initial reaction is, this is dope. That's the first thing I saw. Like, I just like it, I have thought a lot about presenting, and because I come from a fine arts background, because my MFA was in painting, it made me think really clearly about this story that when I was teaching at another institution, we had this faculty show. And I'd had a couple books published by then, and they were like, you need to put a book in the show. You need to put something in the show, like put up something on the wall. And I'm like, ain't nobody got time for that. Like, I just don't have time for that. They actually called the show, Ain't Nobody Got Time for That. which is like
Good one.
perfect. Yeah, so like perfect, right? So eventually the chair, Yoav Horish, who's a really good friend of mine, who's chair of photography at the time, he was like, just send me some digital images. I'll print them for you and we can put them in frames, and we did it. So I sent him a couple of images and then he print them he print them and they looked really good, and I put them in frames and we took them to the show and they were in the show. But at the same time, the book that those things came from, which was the picture book that's over my left hand, over my shoulder here, the Bessie Stringfield picture book that I had just done had just come out. And so I got the book and like walked around the opening of the show showing people the book. Like, don't look at the stuff on the wall, look at this. And it made me realize that, you know, like what Hillary said about the idea of like putting stuff on the wall for cartoonists, it's completely out of context. Like, it's good for me to like geek out on like how many brush strokes that James Stern used on the side of his page, right? That's something that I really geek out about. But the context of it is almost missed if you don't have everything together. And I think that was what I thought was really great about this exhibition, is because it has the workup, you know, it has the books that are out there, but it also has these giant comic pages, so you can actually see some excerpt from it. And I've been thinking a lot about that with my students, like how do we present our work as a thesis program? And I think that that's the thing that's missing. And I think that that's the beauty and also like the brilliance of this exhibition, which I think is amazing, to go into a space and basically come into a space that is like a reading space, a presentation space, and a making space all at one time, which I think is just incredible. And you guys did a fantastic job of doing that. We took my students yesterday there and they were like, this is great. They were like, let's make our space like this as well. So I really enjoyed it. I think I think everybody should see it. And I think it's a really innovative way to think about how comics work, because the thing about comics that I think a lot of people, specifically in situations where we're looking at like individual images in fine art and thinking about it, like people miss the fact that these are things that words and pictures go together. Words and pictures are part and parcel of the whole thing. So with seeing things out of context, you should, like, it's not, the story is what the art form is, it's not the individual page. And so showing that in that context is really important.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think a lot about that ecosystem that the work kind of travels in a lot as well. You know, as I mentioned earlier, like when I'm on that airplane and that first reaction is like, oh, you're a cartoonist, like people conjure images of like, you know, their favorite, even if they're thinking about animated shows, like there's something, they get warm and fuzzy when they hear the word cartoon. And I think as a young man, I was like, wait, I'm going to tell you the type of comics I do. And they could maybe get, you know, feel like browbeaten or something.
Yeah, their eyes glaze over.
Yeah.
Their eyes glaze over because it's like, I always say it, and they're like, do you draw for Marvel or DC? And I'm like, I don't draw superhero comics at all. And it's just like their eyes glaze over.
Yeah. Well, now I just try to like kind of lean into that, like, oh, you love comics? Great. Like suddenly there's a space to have like a conversation, and people are kind of willing to be engaged. And when we do these graphic guides, it's like, I think of them as projects that are part of a bigger ecosystem where they get into schools, they get handed out at conventions and conferences, at public libraries. We work with partners to get them distributed with advocacy groups and organizations that are advocating and educating around issues around healthcare and democracy. So the comics is a way to facilitate that conversation. And that's kind of like one of the nice things also about the Quarantine Public Library is that, you know, there's a tutorial, you can download it, you can make it, then you can share it, you can upload these things and download the things. So that's really interesting to me, the kind of distribution system of these comics as well.
James, can I ask a quick question of you? So how many copies of This Is What Democracy Looks Like have been distributed in, say, schools? It's some really large number, right?
Yeah, that is a good question. So we distributed these comics, we distributed them through like Diamond, which is the comic book distributor that distributes through to all the comic stores throughout the country. So we work with them to distribute them, and then comic retailers buy them, you know, pretty much at cost, and then just distribute them to people free in communities throughout the country. And then with something like the democracy book, we worked with a Chicago nonprofit called the Mikvah Challenge, who work with social studies teachers throughout the country.
Mhm.
So, and then we did a Kickstarter where we, myself and one of my graduate students at the time, Coco Fox, we visited all these schools in the Midwest that Mikvah helped facilitate and gave presentations facilitated, using graphic facilitation about democracy, and then handing out the comic, and people were just so jazzed at that point to get it. So yeah, tens of thousands of copies have been distributed, through all these various channels, and then charter school might order some or whatnot, and then with all these graphic guides, we put them online for free, and you can go to cartoonstudies.org to find those, and anybody can just go and just download a PDF of it as well. So that of course increases the circulation by quite a bit.
Mhm.
I think it's just, I just want to say this just as a general thing, like comics at BU, comics at Boston College, and comics at Harvard, Northeastern, y'all got to get it together, Hillary. Y'all got to you got to do some kind of big show, and so we can just have everybody doing comics. Like, I just think it's just, like the graphic guides, and just leaning into that empathy gap that I think that people have, and that the thing about how comics tend to speak in two different languages that we hear simultaneously as one thing, is to do that and to use that as a way in which to teach people something is something that I feel like is just we're at an amazing moment in the way we think about comics, and how people, when I talk to people, I hear that same thing, James. It's you draw comics. I'm I'm a cartoonist. And they're like, well, what do you draw for Marvel or DC? And I'm like, I don't really do that. And I had a woman tell me once, she said, I don't like comics. I just can't really get in the superhero thing. And I'm like, well, I don't draw superhero. What do you like? And she legitimately said, historical fiction. I'm like, well, I got some books for you.
Strange fruit, here we come.
I know, right? So, just taking that and then building a space around those kind of things, when I was talking to Meg earlier about that, not having superheroes and looking at comics as a medium as opposed to a genre, and looking at it as the thing that we use as our artistic expression. I think that that is a really interesting. I think that this show really shows people the capacity of comics to tell people stories, and what kind of stories, and even to humanize those stories, because of that idea of the empathy that we can feel in those, the cartoon, the simple little cartoons that people think is really easy to draw. And I always say, well, if you think it's really easy, sit down and try to do it.
One of the textbooks that we use at CCS is Hillary's book, Why Comics? And you've written really eloquently about comics as journalism, comics as graphic medicine, and how comics use space to kind of depict interior and exterior states. And I wonder if you would want to talk a little bit about that, Hillary, as well.
I would love to. I was thinking of that earlier when you mentioned, that these graphic guides seek to give the lay of the land.
Yeah.
Because I feel like with comics being a spatially specific art form, the idea of the lay of the land is kind of literal. And, I taught health and wealth in my course last year at Northeastern called graphic medicine. And one of the things that I really responded to, and my students really responded to, is the way that graphic guide, James, that you did with other people, demystifies the space of the hospital. So there's a part of health and wealth in which there's some pages devoted to the history of the hospital. And then also there's an amazing double spread with a cutaway view of a hospital, with information you can be charged the moment you walk through the door. And we see the door and we see the interior space. And there's information about facility fees. And I think, comics as a medium that traffics in time and space has the ability to be diagrammatic in a really powerful way that can reveal spaces, including medical spaces, to a profound effect. So when I think of graphic medicine as a sort of collective and a movement and what it can do, I think of that moment in health and wealth as a really important one. So I think the idea of diagramming in space is so key. And I could go on, but we see this in a different valence in This Is What Democracy Looks Like, where there are a lot of arrows and lines of connection and sort of almost like flow chart aesthetics to try to reveal the connection of different branches of government and how they work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hillary,
Shout
I
out
was
to
thinking-
my
sorry.
collaborator, Casimir Lee, who did the artwork in Health and Wealth. And I had a totally different design, and they suggested that cutaway view, and it was brilliant. And one of the real joys of working on these and these graphic guides is being able to work with these amazing cartoonists and bringing in scholars and journalists and students to kind of explore a topic. And where many of us often are just kind of coming to it for the first time. So we're asking all these dumb questions and we're figuring it out. And when we're creating these pages, I mean, one of the things that you just spoke to a little bit is with panels on a page, like a panel is like a discrete unit of time, right? And on any given page, you're arranging these discrete units of time. It's a sense-making activity, and you can actually see the past, present, and future all melded together into a single page or a single spread. And that's really powerful because I think it reflects kind of like how our brains work, right? We're not just always living in the moment as much as we'd like to be. We're thinking about things that have happened, things we hope to happen or hope to avoid happen. And comics are really, really good at reflecting that.
Mm-hmm.
James, do you think that, like I was talking about this earlier today when Meg and I were talking, and I was talking about the compact between the author and the cartoonist and the person who reads it when that happens within the gutter, right? Because that's where we have that conversation. Do you think, and I just like thought of this at the top of my head, do you think that that's what helps build that empathy because the reader is so like invested in the story because they actually have to help finish it?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember, and maybe one of you were. I remember, I think it was Chris Ware talking about how like the comic's almost like a record, and the reader like it's like music that your eye is like a photograph needle, and then you read the music, and the music that you read the notations, and the music plays in your head. And I feel like there's an element of comics that does that, right? You're looking at these little pictograms, and then you're filling in things between those gutters, and they're like little notations of a musical score that you then play in, as an interior symphony, so to speak.
James, Joel, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I feel like that's what and as I think about this, I feel like that's the thing that helps create that empathy, because people, when you read, there's a feeling of disbelief. So when you connect with something, it's like when you connect it. And so I think because comics so uniquely engages the reader to basically help finish that story, that's why that empathy becomes so powerful. That and the expressive drawing, like that's the thing that people really latch onto. That's just, I just thought about that when y'all were talking.
Joel, just to pick up on that, just the side note, what I was going to say before is that Chris Ware has called comics the art of the empathetic doodle, which I thought of, James, when you were just talking, which I think is a good description of comics. But I mean, thinking where that empathy comes from, yes, I think the kind of encounter that the reader has with a page of comics, say, that you two were just describing is part of it. But Joel, something you just mentioned at the end of your last comment was the expressive drawing. And I think that's a huge part of it too. It's this connection with something that's handwritten. Whether the work was created with Bristol boarded ink or it was created, with a digital tablet, there's a hand making that mark. And so I think a lot of these works have a certain kind of intimacy that's very appealing for that reason, the hand drawn aspect of it. So I think that's key to empathy here.
I think that, I was going to say, I think that like that idea of like expressive drawing is a thing that most people don't connect to cartooning. They think it's more about shape design, but it's really about economy of line and organization of design to like basically take these two things, like it's almost like when I do figure drawing with my students, I'm like, look at the way you've drawn that leg. Look at how simplified that is. That's like the perfect thing that you can use to draw your legs moving forward. And I think sometimes people who don't draw comics are completely out of the loop that that's what you have to do in order to get to a place where you can draw like Chris Ware, right? Like those aren't real people, right? But the way he draws them feel really real because he can draw real people and he can distill that line down. And I think that thing brings people in, and it's just like, oh, that feels like it's not so specific, like, you know, what Scott McCloud said, it's not so specific that it's somebody else. It's just generic enough. And I'm finishing that story, so I feel way more connected to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think speaking of that, I mean, comics is just as much about graphic design as it is about drawing in some ways. But if it was only graphic design, then reading a comic would be like, you know, reading a series of traffic signs, you know, and that human hand, like, you know, makes it feel, softens it and helps you connect with it. I think also, like, for me as just a cartoonist still, and I don't know, Joel, you feel this way. I feel like when I'm making a work, there's a vulnerability, like here's something I drew. And there's a reason, like, all kids draw comics, right? When they're young. And as they get older, it's like, that's too risky to, like, it doesn't look like I wanted to. And it's like, that's too risky. And it's a real act of bravery to keep sharing the work. And I really appreciate that about the cartoonists, that, you know, just all cartoonists, that they're putting this work out there and they're making themselves vulnerable. And Hillary used the word intimacy, and I couldn't agree more with that as well. Like, the thing I like about the physical objects of the comics is you hold them in your hand, you know, these little one-page zines that you can kind of like hold and make, comic books that you can roll up in your pocket and take with you. And when I'm talking to people about the graphic guides and like, oh, here's a PDF, and, you know, maybe they respond, maybe they don't. If you send somebody a comic book, or that, you know, it's like a whole different conversation. It's a whole different conversation. And the comic book, it's like it's embodied, and you can't click and check your email when you're reading it, or go onto a Discord server, and you read it, and it sits, and then maybe a parent or a cousin or a friend reads it, and it gets passed along, and it moves through the world in such a different way.
I wonder if I could ask you both a really quick question about style, since we're talking about drawing and expressivity. I was really struck in the two graphic guides that are excerpted on the wall. This is what democracy looks like, and Health and Wealth, how different the styles are. And so in This Is What Democracy Looks Like, it's a kind of loose, sort of minimalistic style. And then in Health and Wealth, the characters in that comic book are drawn to look like characters out of Richard Scarry books for children, which I immediately recognized. And I have to say, my college students did not, which made me sad. My son would recognize it. So I'm wondering if either or both of you could talk about those stylistic choices, because one seems sort of demystifying to me, and the other seems sort of defamiliarizing. Like, you think you know this story, and here it is told with a different kind of cast of characters.
Joel, I'll why don't I just talk to the specifics of those graphic guides, and then I'll let you talk about the subject more generally. But yeah, I mean, so the This Is What Democracy Looked Like was the very first graphic guide we did, and Dan Knott, who's really just so brilliant at depicting systems and doing explainer comics, had just graduated from the Center for Cartoon Studies, and there was a point in 2016 where the political winds were changing, and people were wondering, you know, about democracy and what is it? And there were polls showing most people couldn't name all three branches of government. So I asked Dan to work on the democracy comic with me. And Dan's style is almost like whiteboard, like they're very whimsical in a way and playful, and almost like a whiteboard. And there's a vibe to the work that's like a lot of white space, and you kind of move through the comic in a way that is very brisk. And I feel like sometimes, like with nonfiction comics, like one of the ones that don't work as well for me, or the ones that have so much text and like every square inch is covered with images. And Dan has such a wonderful light touch while really creating, really cleverly creating that information hierarchy. And for the healthcare comic, we wanted to create, it's such a fraught topic. And we wanted to, I was thinking about the Schoolhouse Rock videos and children's books, and Richard Scarry, of course, is such a master at explaining things visually. And when we first started working the team, there was, we were joking, we want to create something that even a politician could understand. They're the ones that ultimately that could create policy. And we actually did a GoFundMe campaign because that's where most Americans get money to pay for healthcare, sadly now. So we did a GoFundMe campaign called, GoFundMe Can't Fix Healthcare. And
Right.
And that helped pay to send an issue of Health and Wealth to every member of Congress. So we sent that last year. And so, yeah, so that was intentional to create something that was inviting, a kind of like a playful space where like, hey, we can get a grip on this because, healthcare in the system is like a dumpster fire. Joel, how do you kind of, in terms of your style and how you address different topics in your work as well? I'd love to hear about that.
I think, I talk about this a lot when I talk about how subject forming content and how, the subject, the thing that you're drawing can be changed by the way in which you draw it and give different meanings. And for me, for the exhibition, I took like Richard Scarry as drawing something super complicated, but safe. Right. So like, I feel like in that exhibition, in the Health and Wealth, it was like how you can draw something that's that complicated and make it safe, because my wife works in healthcare. It's obtuse. I have no idea what's happening in that stuff most of the time. Like when we get all of our stuff, she reads it all because I have no idea. And then when looking at democracy, it was just like having that explainer, sort of like you described it, like an explainer sort of text. Like a whiteboard sort of drawing, like you're just drawing these things. I think that made sense for what it was, because it's it's kind of a straightforward thing that people have made super complicated, democracy in general. So I think looking at that is how I interpreted those two things. But style as a way in which to draw things, I think is a really I think French cartoonists do this a lot, like where they take a style that looks like an all ages style or whatever, like a cartoony style, and draw something really serious and very sad. And I think that's not a thing that I would like. It's kind of like making an adult cartoon, right? Like I think everybody my age, Hillary, we're about the same age. You were probably like traumatized by Watership Down too, right? Like.
I'm actually adopting that graphic novel.
I know, that's what I mean. I thought about it, but at the same time, I remember being traumatized by that and being terrified.
Oh, yeah. I've heard that from so many people, especially that's the 70s animation, but yes.
Yeah. And so like, I think it's like important for artists to take the tools and really elicit feelings. Like if you can open up, like I remember the first time I opened up March, Andrew Iden gave it to me at SPX, and he was like, here, and he had given me like a synopsis of it the year before. And so he brings it to me, and I sit behind my table and I start to open it up, and I flip through like 3 pages and I almost start crying. So I have to close it and put it under the table. And I'm like, I'll read this later. Right. I think when you can take paper and ink or paint and watercolor or digital media and make somebody cry with this, that's an amazing thing. And I think if you can take and push and pull on those, that way in which we think, like we expect one thing, right? If you expect one thing and you get something completely different, whether it's like something very dramatic or something very funny, or, like that whole thing about like, comedy and tragedy and all of that living within these little things, that you can use a stylistic way to draw something, right? I think Chris, Hillary, you can tell me if this is right, because I think you actually wrote this. I'm just going to quote it. Chris Ware said something one time where it was something along the lines of like, a character is the hieroglyphic that I want everything to like, I want you to look at that character and see like their entire history. And I think that's a stylistic choice, right? Because you have to draw that character in a way that people will resonate, whether you're looking at like softening edges so that people feel soft, or sharp edges so that people feel hard and tough, or even taking a hard and tough character and making them with real hard angles and then making them the soft character, right? Like, I think those are the things that we push and pull when we're thinking about style. And I think that, I don't know if y'all did this on purpose, James, but the fact that the Richard Scarry is like super complicated but safe, and then the This Is What Democracy Looks Like, it's sort of like soft and like it's also safe, but like in a more of explainer way, was just a brilliant choice by you guys. It was like, I love those books a lot.
Thank you. The idea of them is to engage people and invite them in, and I'm glad to hear that's working. So at this point, our conversation is going to wrap up, or at least until after we do some questions. So I think we have a chance now to view some of the images from Drawing Us Together, public life and public health and contemporary comics. And after this brief slideshow, we'll move to the audience questions, and we'll talk some more. All right, let's head back and tackle some questions here. So one question that somebody asked, we should all draw, shouldn't we? And their question is, assuming no subject is off limit, how do you approach difficult subject matter in your work? Joel, you deal with some pretty heavy stuff in your work. Do you want to start with that, and we'll go from there?
I think the best way to think about dealing with pretty difficult topics is to first spend about 20 years in therapy. I think that can help, first of all, number one, so that you don't cry when you talk about it. And then number two, to get to a place where you feel comfortable talking. I mean, I talk pretty openly about sexual abuse and violence and trauma and racism that I suffered as a kid. And it was one of those things where, in thinking about and writing Fights, I had to think to myself, like, do I want to put this out into the world? And the thing that was the clincher for me in doing that was like, am I going to help someone if I put this out there? And so what I try to hold on to, and what I try to tell students, is that you are unique, but your story isn't. And especially if you've survived or you come out the other side, and I don't mean just like tragedy porn, right? I mean, like, if you've come out the other side and you have something to give to someone else, I think that's the way you think about it. And I think you have to think about really creative ways. I mean, mostly because Americans are desensitized to a lot of things anyway. I think you have to come up with creative ways in order to give people that information without being super explicit or super, like you don't want anything to be gross, but you want people to be engaged with it and sort of recognize it. So I think that I think you have to sort of think about a system in which to tell those stories where you feel safe and you feel comfortable and you are helping somebody else. Because if it's just a documentary, I mean, you can do that. That's okay. I'm not saying don't, but I would think that if you want to feel okay about something like that, you should really think about what you're contributing to the world.
Hillary, I was going to ask you, you worked with with Art Spiegelman, talking about mouse and MetaMouse, and with the book MetaMouse. I mean, talking about tackling difficult subject matters, I would imagine you would have some insight to this question as well.
Yes, so I mean, that's been an ongoing interest of mine is thinking about expressing traumatic histories in comics. But just quickly to bring it back to Joel, as a person who has taught his book Fights and is a big fan of his book Fights, I just wanted to, Joel, ask you two specific things because I think they might be interesting if you could say a little bit more. I mean, so the first one is that in Fights, you do something really brilliant in terms of using silence and using like black space, like the color black and like dark spaces versus visually articulated spaces, which I think is really brilliant. And you also do something that I had never seen before, which has to do with people calling other people the N-word, for example, and how you represent that. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about those techniques.
So the use of black, to whenever I show sexual abuse in the comic, I always talk about it as like a black box, and in that box will be a big word balloon and a small word balloon, and sometimes they'll be colored. And so I try to think about it in the ways in which, Mary Oliver said this thing that once that I think is really amazing in her book, Rules for the Dance. And she said that emotion doesn't create style, style creates emotion. And what I took that to mean was that in order to understand how to affect people with a thing, you have to step away from it and look at it objectively and think, okay, so if I draw this black square, what will that represent for people? And if I put just barely suggestive language in that black square and those word balloons, a small word balloon and a big word balloon, you'll get a power imbalance and you'll understand that this is happening at night, right? So and then adding the words in there will give a sense of all of that without actually being really explicit. And then with the word, with the N word that I use, and I still do this a lot with all of my comics, is I put a racist caricature, like a minstrel show character, in the word balloon. And so there was two reasons for that. One is I was trying to figure out how not to just write this word over and over and over again. Because I put it as these were all developed when I was doing Strange Fruit. And the second thing was I wanted to make the dichotomy between when Black people said the word and when white people said the word in the book.
Yeah.
So when Black people say the word, it's just the word. It's Nigga. So it is legitimately just a word. But when white people say it, especially when white people are using it in the context of being racist, it has a history to it. And it goes back to that thing that I was saying about what Chris Ware said about that idea of comics have an image having a hieroglyphic sort of history to it. And that image has a history. I have never had to explain that image to anybody. Everybody immediately sees that and they automatically know what it means. And I also wanted to make that word, that image, completely devoid from the Black characters in the book. So it doesn't look like anybody, right? It is a generic, it is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. It is the invisible man that people see, right? When they see Black people. And so that's what I was trying to do in Fights when I was doing that. And, it's funny because I think I had a book signing at the Harvard bookstore years ago. And somebody asked me how do you feel drawing these serious topics with this all ages sort of style? And I was and I just legitimately couldn't answer it. I was just I have no idea how to answer your question because I don't think about it like that. It's just expressive drawing that,
right.
I think conveys information. And I think when you take the totality of that, that's where you get all of the information from.
Right. James, I could say more about your question, but Maybe we should move on. Presence and absence, as Joel was just saying, very powerful.
All right, let's go to another question. We get a couple questions in. Can you speak more on graphic medicine and how it works both in educating medical professionals and how it works with people who are involved in the medical system as patients or caregivers? What is it about the comics that speak to each of these groups of people?
Maybe I could jump in, or Joel, do you want to start?
I'll just say something really quick. I think comics talks to everybody. That baseline systematic semiotics, that base understanding about how we all communicate and communicate with symbols. And I don't necessarily think that it's like especially important for these. I think it's especially important for humans, if that makes sense. I think everybody would benefit. And so like, I think that's why, and I think it's one of those things that in the last couple of years, people are starting waking up to the idea that we all understand this stuff on a visual level. We are visual culture. Like in 2015, the word of the year was an LOL emoji. I mean, so like we're a visual culture. And so I think it connects that way.
That's so interesting. So just to think about the graphic medicine collective and movement in general. So as Meg mentioned, this movement defines its interest as the intersection of comics and healthcare. And so one of the things I've really admired about this movement, and I've written about this a little bit, and obviously I teach classes in this, is that it's comprised of people from different perspectives. So, you know, cartoonists, doctors, nurses, you know, medical administrators, and of course, you know, artists and patients. And, you know, there's just so much to say, I think, about what comics can help to communicate. But just really quickly, I'll mention that from a doctor perspective, someone like Dr. Michael Green, who is also part of that exploratory seminar, has written about this. He has started using comics in his medical school classes to help teach his students how to relate and how to communicate in medical spaces. But I think specifically to the question about patients, I think comics can be a really powerful form for patient narratives in order specifically to express certain kinds of experiences, particularly ones around physical pain that can't be communicated easily only verbally. So, you know, if we think about the famous pain scale of the smiley faces and the frowning faces, right? That's a visual language, precisely because that's a kind of experience and a kind of embodiment that can't be easily communicated verbally. So I think the addition of the visual layer in patient narratives has come to be seen as something really important, both for patients themselves expressing their experiences and their feelings that relate to medical healthcare, but also just in terms of communication in medical spaces in general.
Thank you. Should we try to get in at least one more question? Let's see here. Healthcare and democracy are two good areas for graphic guides. What other topics would you like to see done? Any examples out there already that you like? Audience member says, I would love to see a graphic comic book dealing with estate planning, left behind, IRAs. That would be good. A graphic guide to visual financial literacy and all that. I think all those are great suggestions. I think there's, you know, part of the motivation of doing the graphic guides was kind of like almost as like a civic duty, so to speak, and trying to tackle big things so we can create that space to talk about them. So, you know, we would like to do one about climate change. We're working with the Harvard Prison Project and Kaya Stern, who I met through Radcliffe, about doing one about mass incarceration. And we did an exploratory seminar with some amazing people to kind of explore what that book might look like. And then there's a couple cartoonists I'm working with, Tilly Walden and Emma Hunsinger, about a graphic guide to creativity, because not all which is a big topic too, but not each one of these has to be so fraught and and challenging. You know, we could also do graphic guides about creativity. I'm talking to somebody about doing a graphic guide to meditation. So, you know, I know Haley J. Pope is a great cartoonist, and she does a lot of cartooning around the intersection of comics and law as well. So that's a really interesting place that people are making comics as well. Anybody, any graphic guides, Joel, on the horizon for you? I mean, you're in fact, like in some ways, you're working on a really high profile graphic guide in a way, aren't you?
Yeah, I just finished and I think we're getting proofs next week of the adaptation for Dr. Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning, a definitive history of racist ideas in America. So it's going to be a graphic history of racist ideas in America. So I was able to turn that 500-page book that's incredible and with lots and lots of research into a 280-page graphic novel. And Dr. Kendi was very gracious in letting me put fart jokes in his book. So there.
Those pages look great that you showed me this summer, by the way. It's going to be phenomenal. I'm really looking forward to seeing it.
I will make sure you get a copy. Both of you will get a copy.
All right, let's one quick one, and then before we have to go. How has satirical cartooning been used in public health messaging? John Layman's Chew was a satirical reminder of the SARS emergency. Does anybody can speak to that?
I know of one. I don't know how else to say it, and Kathy might be even watching, but Kathy Leamy, who's a cartoonist in Boston, did a really great comic that was called Diabetes is Out to Get Your Blank, about impotence, which was incredible. Like it was hilarious. Like the whole thing was great, and it was like it also got to the point. And I think that's like the best way to use. I mean, personally, I think that's the best way to use vulgarity is to like shock people into like laughing about something so that they'll always remember it, and like forever, I will remember that comic.
You know, we're getting close to wrapping up now, so rather than try to do another question that we're not going to be able to really respond to well and give it the attention it deserves. I think I just want to thank you both for coming in. If you have any last remarks, I'd love to hear them. But Hillary, thank you so much for being part of this exhibition and teaching me so much about comics and through these conversations.
Thanks for teaching me so much about comics. And thanks, Meg, for putting together this show. It's really exciting.
It's an amazing show. I spent all summer reading everything that Hillary wrote. So I think everyone should do that too. All of her academic papers, which are amazing. I can't tell you, like, she put me on a rabbit hole of like reading about postmodernism, and I just like lost 2 weeks of like life.
You told me that, and I didn't know whether that was a good thing or a bad thing.
It was a good thing.
Joel's just really spiritual, and I teach your work all the time. So this conversation has just been really a pleasure for me.
It was great.
Pick up a
Thank you
copy
for
of Why
inviting me.
Comics. You will not be disappointed.
And fights and
Fights
others.
and others. Joel,
Market
thank you
day.
so much.
Market day.
Market day. I
Yada
teach
yada.
that too.
Well, thank you both, and I look forward to further conversations, and I look forward to going and seeing the show and being in that space. As a cartoonist, I make these spaces, and to be actually have one of these that I can enter and geek out on it will be super fun. So thank you both. So this concludes our program today. So thanks, Hillary and Joel, for this thoughtful conversation. Meg, for curating such a wonderful exhibition, which I encourage everyone to visit, and our audience for the trail questions. I wish we could have gotten to more. Registration to visit Drawing Us Together, Public Life and Public Health in Contemporary Comics is now open and can be accessed through the Radcliffe website, which is radcliffe.harvard.edu. The exhibition is free and open to the public through December 17th, 2022, Mondays through Saturdays, 12 to 5. Since health and safety of our visitors at Radcliffe, our primary concern, advanced registration is encouraged before visiting Radcliffe exhibitions. Finally, today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. So for information about upcoming Radcliffe virtual programs and to see videos of past events, visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and take care.